Thanks, Kathy. Fantastic story. We now go live to a reporter in the field, Neil. Neil? Neil. The concept of fake news has generated a lot of critical attention just in the last half-decade. But what exactly is media bias? There are 5 major theories of contemporary political media bias. The first is indexing, which states that the media will tend to favor whoever currently holds political power. Then there's the bad news bias, which states that the media will tend to focus on negative issues in order to create controversy. There's also the pluralist theory, which states that the media will tend to use a variety of interpretations. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but too many interpretations can overwhelm the consumers and make them feel disconnected. There's also the hegemonic theory, which states that the media will use its position of power in order to serve corporate interests. And finally, there's the liberal media bias, which states that the media will tend to favor liberal political issues and demonize conservative ones. Watching cable news or browsing social media will provide examples of all of these biases in varying degrees. But it's your job, as a responsible citizen, to be able to parse through the nonsense, the filler, and the exaggeration, and get to what matters, the facts. They're called the cold hard facts for a reason. They don't always fit with your opinions, and they often leave you feeling like you're ignorant to the issues. And that's okay, because you probably are, and that's okay. Think of public opinion on politics as like guessing marbles in a jar. Most people's guesses won't be right, and some will be terribly wrong. But the average of all these guesses ends up being pretty accurate. This is the concept of wisdom of crowds. With the increase in political coverage over the last few years, we don't usually get to see the jar for ourselves. And this is critical for the concept of wisdom of crowds to work. And even then, we have our own level of political biases that distort our perception further. Being aware of these levels of distortion is the only way that we can truly combat media bias. Historically, the media maintained a certain level of public trust and are expected to be the guardians of truth and objectivity. But with the rise of the internet, people have been turning to online news sources, and trust in mainstream media has taken a substantial decline in recent years. Although traditional media is in a crisis of legitimacy, millions of people still look to these sources. So people are aware that these organizations have these biases, but turn to them anyway? Unfortunately, yes. Consumers are well aware that these biases exist, and they'll tune into media sources that are biased towards their particular perspective. This is the concept of the echo chamber. However, the rise of what is known as alternative media has dominated the world of online political news. YouTubers, podcasters, social media pundits, and alternative news sites are more popular with segments of the population than their traditional counterparts. Alternative media provide an outlet for citizens that are frustrated by the apparent biases in the mainstream, and they also provide challenges to the traditional concepts of media power. But, as we all know, the internet creates as many problems as it solves. The proliferation of the internet has created an industry of unvetted information, totally free from obligations of being unbiased, objective, or even realistic. But thanks to the distrust in mainstream media, people flock to these sources. Chances are, if you scroll through Facebook or Twitter for a day, you'll see somebody repost political content from one of these alternative news sources. And although these are thought to be a challenge to the mainstream media bias, these alternative sources carry biases of their own. The scrutiny you apply to mainstream media should at least match the scrutiny you apply to content from alternative sources, if not exceed. Compare both interpretations of a given story, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Double-check the assertions made by both traditional and alternative sources, and do research on organizations or individuals that they may be connected with. Analyze the content for possible biases and analyze your own reactions. Did you agree with what they said? Why or why not? Will you trust that source in the future? Why or why not? Detecting media bias takes time and attention, but here are some easy tips for responsible citizens to keep in mind. Compare the headlines, op-eds, and editorials with the stories they're connected to. Examine the text and look for loaded language or the use of ambiguous or confusing terms, especially when dealing with political issues. Be wary of any unsubstantiated claims or assertions that are made in the stories. And finally, be skeptical of any unnamed or anonymous sources. Biases are almost impossible to overcome, but by being attentive and not jumping to conclusions, we can limit the power they have on our perception of reality, and we'll be left with only what matters, the facts. Thanks, Neil. Fantastic story. You're one hell of a reporter.